Hello, welcome to Query Designer training. This training is just for CoC admins, as CoC admins will be the only ones to have access to Query Designer. It's not anything that an end user would be able to use. So just so we are kind of on the same page of that. So first I want to talk about just where you'd find the Query Designer tool within ClientTrack. Oh, maybe before I start, just if you're not familiar with what Query Designer is, it's a ad hoc reporting tool where you can go in and you can create a query. Much more advanced than Data Explorer. You have a lot more access to all the tables and things like that in the system. So that's kind of the idea behind Query Designer. It's kind of the next level of being able to do some custom reporting. So you'll find it in the standard work groups. I'm in Georgia HMIS programs, and then on the home workspace under Georgia HMIS reports, you will have Query Designer right here. So end users, of course, they would not be able to access this, but you will be able to go ahead and click on it. I also kind of want to talk about the different access you'll have in training versus production. So in training, you'll be able to go in and have full access to Query Designer. What I mean by that is you'll be able to go create queries, edit queries, things like that. Versus in production, you're going to just have write access to queries. So you'll just be pulling up a query that's already been created and running it. Reason being, kind of the idea behind that is that you're going to create a query in training, kind of test it out as best you can, and then let us as a system admin know that you've got this kind of query ready, and then we'll make sure that it's just looking at your CoC's data. It's not looking at anything outside of your CoC, and then we'll go ahead and bring that into production where you will be able to have read access to it and go ahead and run it. So that way we can kind of make sure that each CoC's data stays protected. So I'm going to go ahead and click on Query Designer here. You're going to see that this pops up in its own window, which is kind of nice, because then that way you can kind of work on queries, run queries, regardless of what you're kind of doing in the system. If you're going in and checking data, pulling up a particular client or whatnot. So I'm going to go ahead and maximize this window. And you can also kind of drag this out too to get a little bit better view of what's going on here. So let's talk about the first thing we see here when we click on Query Designer. On this initial search screen here, this is looking at any query in the system that already exists that you have access to. So we'll see in a little bit that you can set access permissions on your queries where no one else can see them, or you could set it where people could see them but not edit them. And so what you're going to be able to see here, of course, though, is queries that you do have access to. If it is, and it's kind of hard to see on this screen, but if it's grayed, the gray font here under the name, that's going to mean it's read-only, versus a standard black text is going to mean that it's one that you can actually go in and make changes to. So just kind of a distinction there. Also, because of my admin account I'm logged into, there's a whole bunch of queries that I'm seeing here. You'd see a much shorter list when you pulled up the tool in the system. So some other things we have on this initial screen is we can show ID. This can be really helpful in making sure you're pulling up the correct query or the query you think you're pulling up. So every query is automatically assigned an ID, kind of like all things else in HMIS. Any query that is not a 1 billion number, so like these are kind of considered baseline queries. You probably, you might not see these for the most part because you wouldn't have access to them. But just know any query with a 1 billion number, those are going to be queries that have actually been created in the system. And something that's helpful to note, so one thing we kind of do anytime we're talking about a particular query, or like trying to say, tell another person like, hey, go run this query, or can you check this query out? Instead of typing this whole 1,000,068 out, what we'll do is just type in 1B, the letter B, and then 68. So that's totally fine. That'll just make your life and our life a little simpler. Because one of the things you're going to be doing is after you create a ticket, or create a query, and you feel like it's ready, you'll submit an issue ticket on it and say, hey, this needs to be verified that everything's good and it can come into production. So again, you can just kind of talk about these queries by going by the query ID. And also, we probably want you to use query ID and not name, because it is possible a query could be named the exact same name as another query in the system. So as we're talking about, making this kind of the easiest process, working back and forth, going by ID is always the route to go there. We can search up here by query names. So of course we see all the query names here. I can type in search there. Now this is going to just do what's called kind of a begins with search, so we can see that all of these begins with client. However, I can use a wildcard here. So if I type in a % and search, now I'm going to get anything that just has client in the name. So that can be kind of helpful in locating a particular query. You also note that by default it's going to show queries, it's going to show all the categories of queries. A little bit later on we'll talk about a couple of different categories that a query might be in, but by default you're going to be looking at all of those here. Something that can be helpful when you're locating a query is using the date created by sorting by that, so that way you can see a query that maybe you just made and you just need to pull it back up. That's the quickest way to kind of do that. You'll also note there's help bubbles here. You can hover over those and that's going to show you the technical notes on the query, and a little bit later on I'll show you how you can actually set those. But that's kind of a way you can provide some good information as a reminder for yourself in the future when you're trying to say, okay, what does this query do again? You can kind of hover over that and see that. Another option you got from this screen is copy query. So if I click the action button on a query, I can click copy. Now there's kind of two reasons where this will come in handy. So one, maybe a system admin or maybe another CoC admin has made a query that would kind of be helpful for you, and they've shared it in a way where you can access it. So let's say it's in gray, so it's not anything you're going to be able to go edit, and you wouldn't want to edit it if it's someone else's query, right? But what you can do is, as long as you can see it on this screen, regardless if it's read only, you can click the action button and hit copy. And then that's going to make an exact copy of that query that's owned by you. With that copy, you can go in and make any changes you want to. You can go lock that down where only you can see it in the future. And of course, go in and change that query where it's looking for your CoC's data. So that can be a great way you kind of share information or share queries with each other in a meaningful way. Copying a query is also helpful. Let's say you're making kind of a series of queries, and each query is going to be slightly different on what it pulls. Well, instead of having to create that from scratch, you can create one query and then go in and just copy it a bunch of times and then go make those specific changes to each one. Or let's say you've made a query, it's working good, but you want to make some changes and you just don't want to mess it up though. You're not sure if the changes are going to have any bad effect on it. Well, you can always just go create a copy of it, mess with the copy, and then you've got your original one that's going to be safe and sound. So just a few kind of best practices you can do with the copy button. Other thing here, if we wanted to actually pull up one of these queries, we could just click on it, or we can click the action button and hit select. Either one of those is going to pull up the query. You've got an import button down here. You're not really going to use that, so you can disregard that. But we do have new query, and so this is really important because this is what you'll be clicking on if you actually want to create a new query. So if what we're wanting to do next is not pull up a query that we've already made, well, let's go ahead then and click new query, and we can kind of see what comes up there. So this is going to be where we kind of start the process of creating a brand new query. So let's kind of talk over the different options that we've got here. One, of course, we want to have a query name. So kind of the best practice of how we're going to kind of do it in Georgia is for each CoC, they're going to start the query name like this. So if I was in Atlanta CoC, I would start it there. Then I could call it whatever I wanted to. This is just will be very helpful in kind of organizing these queries so we know whose is whose. Next we have runnable by. So this was what I was talking about kind of earlier. So you've got access on who can run this query and then who can edit it. So by default, I'd probably, by default it's going to be me only on both of these, and I'd really recommend leaving it on that. You do have some other options here, such as my organization, which is going to be based on your owning organization, everyone, or people with query designer access, which actually will kind of be the same because only certain people have access to query designer. These things would kind of be would have the same effect. And then you've also got editable by, and you'll have these kind of same options here, me only, my organization, well, and in this case you're just going to have everyone listed as well. A little bit later on I'll actually be able to show you where you can go set this to share it with your CoC, and so what that will mean is if you've got multiple CoC admins, each of them could go in and kind of see this. So something that might be a common thing you'll do is make it runnable by your CoC, which again I'll show you where you can set that a little later. But keep it editable just by you, so that way no one can mess with that. If they need to make a copy of it, they can, but they can't, change yours. So you have those options there. By default, queries are going to be created under the ad hoc category, and we do want to leave that initially. So what we're going to kind of have you guys do is you'll create the query, it'll be under ad hoc. When you are ready to go in, or when you're ready for us to go in and check your query to see if it's ready to go into production, and again we're just going to be checking it to see if it's filtering by your CoC's data. What we'd want you to do is go put that under test, and then put that under, and then go ahead and submit a ticket on it. So that's going to then let us know we need to go look at it, and we'll easily be able to find it just by going to the test category. And I'll show you a little bit later. All these options here you'll be able to change. So while you're creating it under the ad hoc category initially, you'll be able to go in later and change it to test once you're ready for that stage. Next is the based on form. So this can save you a lot of time. What this will do, and you can only use this option when you're initially creating a query. So you can't create a query and then go back and say, I kind of want to base it on a form instead. But what you'll be able to do here is you can click this little magnifying glass, and then it's going to allow you to search all of the forms in the system. So kind of every form for the most part you see in ClientTrack, it's a form. It's form. It's got a form ID. You can get that form ID or the name of that form and search for it. And when you're creating a query, you can go ahead and base that query on that form. What that's going to do is save you some time because it's going to pull in all of the tables and all of the fields and columns from that table into your query instead of you having to kind of build it from scratch. For the most part, this works pretty well. There's definitely been some times I've used it, especially on custom forms sometimes, where you can kind of get some funky results and you still have to go in and kind of work with it and do some manual kind of patching it up. But like I said, it is something that you can use. So for instance, if there's a form in the system and you're like, okay, this is all the data I really want to build a query for, or at least to start with, definitely go in and to try to base it on a form. And I'll show you a little bit later how you can actually find what ID any form is in the system, because that's another kind of new functionality we're opening up to our CoC admins here soon. And then finally we have query technical notes. So this is what I talked about. You could see by hovering over the little question mark here. And so this can be whatever is helpful for you. You can type this in here and you can come in and add to this later on. So if you are typing in initial, like what this query is pulling now, or what kind of the idea, since we're just creating this brand new, what the idea behind this query is, you can go ahead and type that in now, and then later on you can come in and add that, change it, or do whatever you need to do. So I'm going to go ahead and click done now, and it's going to kind of now take us into this brand new query that we've just created. So now let's go ahead, for this training I'm actually going to exit out of this box here, but this box is trying to go ahead and have us select what tables we want to be part of this query. I'm just going to pull this box back up manually in a second by clicking on here. But first I want to kind of just go through the layout of what you see when you're working on a query. And so this is a query that we got pulled up now, even though we don't have any information on it, we don't have any tables, don't have any fields. But let's go ahead and kind of walk through what we're seeing here. So we can see the name of the query is going to be here in the top right. If I hover over that, you'll see that it lists the query ID there. You can also see the query ID here. So like I mentioned, every query you create, it's automatically going to have an ID assigned to it. You have the little notepad icon here. If I hover over that, I'll be able to quickly see the technical notes I created. So that can be really helpful. Also, you do have the help button here, and you can actually create an issue ticket straight from here. So this would be where if you're working on an issue ticket, and if you're working on a query and you're like, okay, this thing's good to go. I just went and changed the category of it to test, and I want a system admin to go ahead and look at it. You can actually just do it straight from here, report an issue, include the 1B325 in the subject line, so we know what query it is, and then we can go in and check it for you. Continuing on, if we start over here on the left, we'll see a little folder icon. If we click that, that is going to basically let us go back to that query selection screen and open up a brand new query that's already been created. So let's say we were creating a query, but we're like, actually I want to pull up a brand new query. I don't want to create a new one. You can do that. Or if you're working on a query and you just want to start a brand new query instead of the one you're working on, you can do that as well. So that's all that does. Here we've got the save icon. So this lets you save the progress that you've made on the query. So this is kind of important because you're going to be going in and creating like multiple filters normally, adding different tables, things like that, and so you can save along the way. Also, every time you go run the query, which I'll show you how to do in a second, it is going to save it as well. So you've got kind of two different ways you can save. As you're running it, it's saving automatically, and then you can just manually save it here. And that's just going to save your progress. I haven't added anything yet, so that's kind of why we're getting that error message. This option here, to create a view or function, that's not anything you're really going to be doing, so you can kind of disregard that. This is where we get to the query properties that we've already looked at. So this is where you can go in and maybe we have some more notes we want to add, or we need to go and change the test. That's how we would do that. And then of course just click done when you've made those changes. Here's where you would set parameters, which has to do with the way you do filtering in Query Designer. Some kind of advanced filtering actually. I'll kind of show you a little bit later when we get into filtering how you would set up a parameter. And then here's what you're going to be using a lot. So this is kind of your preview or run query button. When you click on this, it's going to go ahead and run that query. Of course, we don't have anything, so we'll get an error message now. But this is what I was talking about, is every time you run this, it is saving your progress. So you don't have to worry about going back and clicking save over here. Also, doing this is just going to run the pull data within the Query Designer tool. It's not going to put it in Excel or anything like that. The downside to it is it's not the data you're going to see then is not very helpful because it's just kind of viewable on the screen. You can't copy and paste from it. You can't sort it or anything like that. But it is very helpful as you're building a query to make sure what you're putting together is actually pulling in data, and you can kind of get a glimpse of the data and see, is that the data you're actually wanting. So I definitely recommend, as you're building queries, use this button a lot. Pretty much every time I add a new filter, I will go in and do a little preview to make sure that I didn't just break the query, and then continue adding and continuing doing the preview button. Because what you don't want to do is start building this huge query and you've added all these filters, and then you go to preview it for the first time and it's not pulling any data. Well, now you've got to kind of reverse engineer this thing to figure out like where you went wrong, where is it stopping you from pulling in any data. And then your Excel button, that's going to be really important. This is where you actually can export the data that your query is pulling into Excel. So that's what you'll probably be doing once you've got a query working like you want it to. You'll click that, you'll get a nice spreadsheet, and all of your data will be there. Finally, if you are super nerdy and want to just go look at the SQL of the query, you can click this button. It's not going to let you edit or add anything to it or make any modifications at all. It just lets you view what's kind of happening in the background in SQL format. So like as you add filters and tables and columns and all that kind of stuff, then when you click on SQL, you're going to have like a lot of text here. And again, this is just kind of showing the technical, what's happening in the background from a technical point of view when it comes to SQL. Versus, Query Designer, it's kind of, there's like some drag and drop stuff. You're not having to always type out a bunch of text. So Query Designer makes it easy, but again, you can go see the technical side of it there. So I've kind of talked about the layout. Now let's get into actually creating a query and adding tables and filters. So the first thing we're going to want to do is add some tables. Now when I first clicked on new query, it popped this up automatically. So this was what I was talking about. This will come up when you first start the creation of a query because it knows you're going to need a table. But you can access this again by clicking on the edit data definition, and this allows us to go ahead and start the process of adding some tables to our query. Now here's where you're going to start to see just how different Query Designer is from a tool like Data Explorer. While Data Explorer has a certain set of domains that you can easily recognize, just like such as like client and enrollment, it's going to look very different here because this is the actual tables within client track. So these are the tables that all this data is being stored on, which isn't going to always match like a form name or anything like that. So one, I wanted to point out at the top here, you can see there's kind of three different categories. There's table, there's view. Now view is noted by this little symbol here. These actually don't hold data, but they're kind of used to help calculate data from different tables. So for instance, there's a chronic homeless view that will take information from your universal data assessment table and then do some calculations where you can see if it equals chronic homelessness, yes or no. So that's kind of the idea behind views. There's some views that system admins will create from time to time, and then we can kind of lets you guys know what those are. One of the things we want to kind of do as we're opening up Query Designer is come up with kind of an Excel spreadsheet or some kind of a spreadsheet of some sort where we kind of list some common tables, some also the ways that tables can connect to other tables and that kind of thing to pull common data elements. So you can kind of look forward to that. But there's views and there's also custom tables. So every now and then there'll be tables that system admins that we've added to the system to capture some custom information, and those will kind of look like that. It looks like a standard table, but it'll have a C on it. And again, you can kind of by clicking on these, you can filter or exclude those, and then you can search by the table name. And so initially, when you're first building a query, the first table you start with, you're probably going to want to know what table it is. You probably don't want to just start scrolling through here and blindly picking on things. So to do that, there's a new functionality we've opened up to allow you to kind of go in and see within client track what here we go, what tables and what fields make up the different forms you interact with. So I am going to just go into, let's go over to clients, workspace, and just pull up edit client. Because of course this is real basic information, but this is kind of information you're probably going to want on the majority of your queries. So one new feature that you're going to have access to is this audit button. This is really important for, or really helpful in a lot of scenarios. So if you click on that, one, it's going to let you know the particular form ID of the form that you're viewing. Now one thing to note here, we see form ID 1, and so we might think, okay, well that's the form I want to form ID I want to get here. But actually, if you see workgroup override, you'll want to go with that number. What that means is that while 1 was kind of the baseline form that Acovia created, here in Georgia, we've gone in and made a custom version of that for whatever reason. Maybe it's a new field we wanted to add or hide something. So if we've ever done that, then it's a custom form, and kind of like we saw in Query Designer, then it'll have a 1 billion form. Why this can be important to know your form ID is, one thing I showed you guys, kind of a functionality I showed you in creating a query is you can base it around a form. And to do that, you'll probably want to have the form ID. So this is where you'd be able to easily go in and find that. Another thing that's helpful with this little audit tool, and this isn't really to do with Query Designer, but I figure while we're here, why not go ahead and cover it, since this is a new functionality you've got. So you've got this created on and updated on value, and also created by and updated by. So this is really cool because this will tell you when this was created and by what user ID. And of course, if you go over to your user management, you'll be able to see IDs listed there as far as cross-referencing it with actual username. Or you could query, actually you could create a query to show you based on user ID what the username is. But this can be really helpful for all kinds of things. Say you're working on an issue ticket and what they're saying in the issue ticket doesn't line up with the data you see in the system. Well, you can go pull up a service, for instance, or an enrollment, and go in and see when that service or enrollment was created and when it was modified. Maybe the user's gone in and they've made some changes and actually fixed the initial problem they reported on, and that's why you're not seeing what they said, what they mentioned in the ticket. So this is just kind of a tool here at your disposal. Another thing that we're opening up is you're going to have this button here, Form Designer. Now what this is going to do is allow you to actually see kind of the back end of every form in the system and kind of see the tables and where the different fields come from, or where they store their information on a table. So what you're going to have access to here is open read only. So you're not going to be able to go in and edit a form or make any changes or anything like that. But you can open it up, and right off the bat, you're going to start to see the table structure of the fields on this form. So we can see here that If I wanted to query, for instance, first name, well, here's the table that's going to be on the CM client table, and then the field I would pull in is called first name. That's where I would find my first name here. So this is really helpful because you're going to find some fields and some tables that you're not going to just be able to kind of figure out on your own where this stuff is stored, but being able to go in and look at a form, you can quickly identify that. And that's going to be really important. You can also come up here to edit data definition, and kind of like in Query Designer, you're going to see the table structure here, so you'll be able to not only see the different tables in play, but you'll also be able to see how they're connected, the different fields that they're related to. And so that's going to be also important while you're building queries. So now that we kind of know that, we see that CM client is where our basic client information is held. Let's go back to Query Designer and let us search for that table. And here we go. We can see this is the CM client, and we know this is the table because of the icon here. So I'm going to go ahead and click on that, and I'm just going to click Done. At this point, we have a table now in our query. Now there's a couple options here I wanted to kind of go over right off the bat. So one of these is enforce org restriction. Now for the most part, you're going to want to not have this checked. What this will do is this will mean that any queries that you run on this, or any data you pull from this query, it is going to enforce the org restriction based on who you're logged in as when you run the query. So that means, in this case, if the client was marked as restrict to org and you were logged into a different organization, you would not see that. Now, no, for the most part, the queries you're going to be doing are going to be pulling data for a kind of your whole CoC, right? You're not just going to be pulling data for one organization. So having this checked is going to give you a restricted view of the data. So again, for the most part, you're going to want to uncheck that. Now another option you've got here is don't show deleted. I would normally leave this checked, and what this is showing is it's just going to filter out any, in this case for this table, any clients that have been deleted. So we know that in client track, nothing is ever really deleted, or not deleted permanently, but it kind of goes to the recycle bin. What's actually happening in the background when you go delete something in client track is it is marking this active status. It's instead of an A for this field, it's going to be a D. So if we were to pull this field active status, and I can actually show you in a minute, you'll be able to kind of see that way if something's active or not. So long story short, if you want to, you can unclick this don't show deleted, and then we could pull in this active status. Let's go ahead and actually just do that real quick. Pull in this active status as a column. And so to add columns, you got your tables listed over here. So any tables you got, you're going to have here, and then we can just drag over the columns that we want to see. So I'm going to, let's start with client ID. And then I'm just going to go, because we were talking about that active status, what that means. I'm going to pull that in. And then, so here's that preview button I was showing you where you'll want to kind of click this every kind of step you take along creating your query. And you're probably used to seeing this from our menued up queries, but by default it's going to just do max rows 10. I'm going to go ahead and get rid of that so I can actually see a larger list. And here we're going to see all these client IDs and then active status. A means it's not deleted. If there were a D on any of these, then that would mean they were deleted. We can actually see there's some deleted ones here. So going back to kind of my example, if I had this selected, now let's go ahead and run this again. Now we're not going to get any deleted clients as part of our query. And so again, for most part, when you're running queries, you don't want to be seeing deleted services and clients and enrollments and things like that. So that's why I would normally leave that checked. So here we've got our table, we've got our column. We verified it's working, it's pulling in data. So let's go ahead now and talk a little bit more about how we kind of add these columns. So it was drag and drop to get that over here. We can also see now that that's in red, so you can quickly identify anytime you are pulling up a query, you can or a table here over here on the side panel, you can quickly identify which fields here are already part of one of your viewable columns. So that can be just kind of helpful. Another thing you can do is if you click on one of these, it'll actually flash where it is up here. So if you have a whole bunch of different columns, which can sometimes happen on a more involved query, and you're trying to just locate something where it is, you can click on that and it's going to highlight it for you. So we've added our table, we've added some columns. Let's get into some filtering now. So if I run this now, I will get anybody in the system. We're not doing any filtering. So let's start with some basic filtering here. So I'm going to click on this little option here, and kind of we'll start with the most common filtering, and then a little bit later on I will cover some more advanced filtering. But the most common would be starting with a field from your table. So this will list the tables that tables that we've previously added to this query, and then this would allow us to choose all of the fields from that table. So I'm going to say, let's do first name. Now you've got your what's called operators here. Your most basic ones are these right here, and so you've got equals, which is just saying, okay, this name is equal to whatever we're going to type in on the other side of this filter. You've also got some other ones such as less than or equal to, greater than, or equal to. These are normally used on dates. So for instance, if I were sorting by or filtering by, what would be a good field to do on here? Say created date, and I wanted to look at clients that were only created this year, I could do something like this. And then here, so this is the other kind of side of your filter. And the most common thing to do here would be just enter a literal value. So here I could do 1119, for example. Now I'm only going to pull in clients that were created on 1119 or later. So that's where we get into this greater than or equal. So that's kind of how that's used. So another example, if I wanted to use the equal, will be, I could type in John here and change this to first name. Let's see. There we go. And then I can go ahead and run that, and now I'll just get clients with the first name John. Another option you got is this one. This is not equal to. So if I choose this, now it's going to only show clients that do not equal John. The first name is not John. So we can kind of see that here as well. Other common filters you might use here would be in or not in. What this allows you to do is create a list of things that you want to compare it to. So for instance, we'll go with the same kind of idea here that I did with John. So before I just had it equals to John. If I do in, I could say equals to John, equals to Adam, equals to Mary. And now what it's going to do is going to say if the first name is in anything from this list, then go ahead and show it on the query. So I'll go ahead and do that, and now we can start to see some Adams and Mary will start popping up here. In the same way, you could do not in, and do the exact same thing. List John, Adam, Mary out, and it's only going to pull in things where the first name is not any of those. So this can save you some time. Instead of doing something like equals John and then having to go create more filters to say or equals Adam or equals Mary, you can just do it in one step by using the in or not in. So that's kind of how we do add our basic filter here. Now, it's for the most part, it's pretty common. You're not just going to have one filter on a query, right? You're going to kind of have multiple filters that you're going to use. So, in looking at this, you don't see right off the bat a place where you can add another filter. But to do that, you're going to click your operator here on your pre-existing filter, and then you're going to have the option of and or. So these are a little different than all of the other options here because they're actually going to then give you the ability to add another filter to this. So if I say and, now I can add another filter here that it's going to go by. So I could say, you know, we want only created date to be to have happened in this year. So now it's going to say the first name's got to be John and created date has to be greater than or equal to 1/1/19. So of course that'll get a smaller list there. Of course, another big thing that you'll do is you'll want to create filters where there's an or. Now you can easily, when we're adding that, if we clicked or, we would get another layer here of the filters. And this is where you really want to start kind of, and I find it helpful to kind of talk out loud and say like what you're trying to get this query to do when you're adding filters. So for instance, in this case, and let's go ahead and add, actually to make this make a little more sense maybe, I'm going to do, let's do created date here. Okay, and then I'm going to change this to the first name equals John, or we're going to say the first name equals Adam. So let's add that here. So what we're filtering now by is, for starters, it has to be a client that's created after 1/1 or before, or on or after 1/1/19, and the first name has to be John or the first name Adam. So because of this, the way the kind of hierarchy is set up here, this is always going to have to be true, and then just one of these is going to have to be true. Either one of those is going to allow them to populate, but they still have to be created within this range. So hopefully that kind of makes sense, but that's the kind of thought process you want to have as you're adding queries, because it's going to be normal for you to have a lot of different layers of queries, and sometimes it can kind of get confusing on what's actually going to be pulled in when you click to run it. Now, as you're kind of working with filters, you can modify them and kind of change them as you're going. So these can instantly be changed to ors or ands, real easy like that. So if you chose the wrong one or want to switch that around, you can do so. Deleting filters is done by clicking on these same operators here, and you're going to have an option of delete upper or delete lower, and so this is going to delete everything above here, so it'll delete this filter. This would delete the lower, was going to delete both of these. If I didn't want both of these deleted, then I would probably want to go in here and actually use this. Now when I say upper comparison, it's not going to delete all of this, it's just going to delete what's kind of in this square here. So it's just going to delete this part. So this way you're not having to go, you don't have to go delete an entire part of your query or huge section. You can just kind of do it one line at a time. So if I wanted to just get rid of this part, I would just do upper, and boom, we can see that goes away. And if I wanted to delete this one, I could do that. So pretty straightforward there. You can also kind of reorganize your filters here. So if I wanted to change the order of the queries, and this comes in more handy when you've got like a lot of different filters. What you can do is actually just click anywhere on the filter here, and then click and hold, and then drag it to a different filter, and then it'll turn green, and then you can let go. What that'll do is switch those things. So we can see here now first name is up top here, and the created date is here. And again, for this filter right here, it's not really going to make a difference because I just have an and thing here, and there's not multiple layers. But this can kind of help you in certain scenarios when you got a lot more advanced filtering going on. So we kind of learned the basics of filtering, but we've only got one table on here. And so this is just the CM client table. Doesn't give us a lot of information besides just for the most part, the demographics of the client. So a lot of times we're going to want to add multiple tables, or at least more than one. So let's go ahead and kind of look at how we would add another table that's related to the CM client table. So I'm going to click back on my edit data definition, and then here's the table we've got here, and I'm going to click back on the little symbol here that allows us to go in and add additional tables. Now one thing you're going to notice, because we've already got one table added, instead of just listing tables like this, like we were kind of used to seeing, it has certain tables that are listed under CM client. And it's also got this additional verbiage over here to the right. Versus all the tables here, they don't have that. So here's what's going on there. Client track is going to try to kind of guess or predict tables that you might want to add to your query that would be related to the table that you've already got on it. This can be really helpful in saving time, because one thing it's going to do is it's going to not only go ahead and add that table if we select it, but it's also going to connect the table in the proper way, or the way that will kind of make that work, instead of you having to guess what field you're connecting these two tables on. And connecting tables is kind of, when you think of relational databases, it's kind of just a general principle with that. Everything's stored on these separate tables, and then there's going to be something that identifies the record on each of those tables where they're going to connect, and that's how they're going to be able to kind of pull in the right data. So to kind of show that in practice, I'm just going to minimize that now, and I'm going to say, let's say I know the enrollment table. I've gone in and looked at some enrollment forms, and I have figured out that the enrollment table is the one I want. So if I just go in and click that here and add it, well, I've added the enrollment table, but they're not connected. It's actually not even going to let me save that. I can't go run a query or anything, because anytime you're adding tables, they have to be connected. Now I can connect those manually, and I can I just know that these should be connected on client ID, for example. So if I wanted to connect those, I could click here on client ID. So I'm going to click and hold and drag over, and now I've got a connection here. Now it would let me save it, and when I go run the query, it's going to automatically pull in, or allow me to pull in data from the enrollment table as it relates to clients based on client ID. Something that'll make life a little easier, though, is if I go back in here and I go in and look through this list of suggested tables, I can find the enrollment table here, And again, it's going to let me know how it's going to connect the two. It's going to connect it on client ID. I can just click that, click done, and now we've got the table already connected. This can come in handy, especially in maybe more advanced cases or more obscure tables where you might not know how to connect them. This can really help out. So I'm going to go ahead and unclick Unforce Org Restriction because, again, for this query, I don't want it restricting this query based on what org I'm logged in as. Now, something to note on that, even though we're taking the org restriction off here because it's not really appropriate for what we're doing, we will always be adding filters in through the standard filter process of just looking at data for our CoC. So that's kind of where we're going to be doing that. And you could do the same thing even for a particular org or project as well. So even though like you have the enforce org restriction off here, you could always go add a filter that says, you know, look, only show me enrollments from this org, or only show me enrollments for this project. And that's normally the kind of way you'll want to set up filtering within queries. So another thing I wanted to kind of note on here is by default this is going to be what's called outer joined. So we can see here that there's this arrow to the right, and what outer joined is going to do is it is going to let me run this query, and it's going to show me any clients, for example. So if I have the client ID up here, it's going to show me any client IDs from this table, and let's say I add some of these columns here, like case ID, which every time someone gets enrolled someone, they get a case ID anytime they get enrolled in a project. It'll also show me if that person happens to have a case ID, it will show it, but if they don't, it'll still let them populate. And this will make probably more sense when I actually just go do it. So I'm going to leave that connection as such, and I'm going to, well, let's rerun this query now. We're probably going to notice something different here. We're getting now multiple returns for the same client ID. Before, we were just getting this client ID listed one time because that client ID only exists as far as a client goes in the CM client table, only exists one time. But now that we've added the enrollment table to it, for however many enrollments that the client has, we'll start to see that populate that way. So to make that make a little more sense, let's add case ID, and then we can kind of start to see that, oh, these are different cases. In a little bit, we'll actually get into pulling in where we can see like project name and you know, things like that. So now that we kind of know that, let's run this again. Look at all of our options here, and so here's our list of client IDs, and we can see this particular client right here, 407193. They just have null here, which basically means blank. They don't have a case ID, so that means they literally have 0 enrollments in the system. This is just kind of a client that's been created, but there are no enrollments. But we're still able to pull in this client here. If, on the other hand, I went in and I clicked on this, and the arrow is going to turn into 2 arrows. Now this is what's called inner joined. Now I'm saying only show results where there's a record within this table and within this table. So now it's a little bit more restrictive way of connecting tables. If I were to go run this, we're going to see that everyone now has a case ID, but the client ID we had before where there was a null, they're not showing on here anymore. We cannot access them anymore, again, because they don't have an enrollment. So they don't have a case ID. So kind of as a best practice, I usually leave it connected as outer join, because normally I want to see whatever I'm pulling for like the first table, regardless if there's information in the second table or not. But that could be different. You know, if you're pulling creating a service query, and you've connected some service tables to your CM client table, maybe you only want to see results where they actually got a service. But just something to kind of think through. So let's get into kind of expanding our table selection here. So I'm going to go back here, and we've got the enrollment table, which can kind of be helpful. We got case ID. We can get let's see what else is on here that's helpful. We got things like enroll date, right? But you're going to notice there's not anything about like what's the project name or anything like that. So to get to that, there's actually a table we'll kind of want to add to it, which is called enrollment case table. So this will be something really common that you'll want to do, and this is the kind of stuff we'll probably want to have on this this sheet we can kind of put together and list some helpful tables and structures out for you. But it's called enrollment case. Is going to be connected by case ID. If we do it this way, it's automatically going to do that for us. So if I do that, boom, we got that in there now. And then this gives us some more information. Maybe not everything super helpful, but it gives us program ID. Now, program ID is just that. It's not going to give us program name or anything. So really we need to go another layer to get to actually where we could see like what is the program name, or maybe some other information about the program like the project type. So I'm going to go look at my suggestions for enrollment case, and I'm going to see that programs is a table, and it's a suggestion here, and I can go ahead and click on that. I can click done, and now we've got this table. And this table actually has some really cool stuff on it. It has things like program name, program type, which as project type, Hopwa type, some other like could be really important things that you might want to be looking at. So now that we have that, we can go ahead and click save. And now instead of just relying on case ID, let's go in and let's add enroll date, because normally that's something that's going to be important. And now let's go to our program table here and do program name, and let's run this and see what we get. So now we're seeing some things that kind of start to make a little more sense to us, right? We can see this person here, it was enrolled in this program on this day. So now we're getting somewhere. A thing that's going to be really, really important for the particular use case of CoC admins using queries is being able to filter every query by your CoC. And the way you're going to be doing that is based on in the HMIS Universal Data Assessment. We know that there's client location, right? That's captured there, and that's where you will select from a drop-down what CoC the client is in, and where they're being serviced in. And so that's where we want to kind of pull in our queries through filtering. We want to be able to get to that level of data in the system, and then be able to say, okay, only show me a client from from my particular CoC. Right now with the tables, we don't really have that. We don't have any assessments tables pulled into this yet. So let's go ahead and kind of walk through that. So I'm going to go in. Let's go into add more tables. And again, you're going to find out as you're building queries, unlike Data Explorer where you can just kind of connect a couple domains, it's going to be really common for you to end up having to connect a lot of different tables together to get the information that you want. Now some of this stuff I just kind of know off the top of my head, so you wouldn't really be able to just kind of guess this. But again, if you go in and kind of look at forms and in design mode, you'd be able to kind of pick out some of this stuff. But I know that for enrollment, if I want to look at entry assessments, that I want to add the assessment table. And the assessment table is where it stores the master assessment information. Now the master assessment, of course, is really simple. All it is really is a assessment type, as in entry, exit, annual, that kind of thing, and then a date. It's not the actual individual assessments like domestic violence assessment or barriers and things like that. Those are all kind of held on different tables. But this does get me to the master assessment table. So I'm going to go ahead and add that here, and we're going to kind of see this branch off now from this table here. And again, I'm going to have to remember to unclick this unforced org restriction if I don't want that. And now we can get some things like assessment type and created date, assessment date, and that kind of thing. But we're still not getting any actually of the individual assessments that are recorded normally with an enrollment. And this will kind of be found on this next table I'm going to add. So we know that enrollments are connected to master assessments, and then master assessments is where all of those individual assessments we do for our clients, those are tied to the master assessment. And so you're going to find the majority of all those here. So we can see this is kind of quite a large list of different assessments. What I wanted to look at is client location, though. I want to pull that in. And of course, that's found in system on the universal data assessment. The table that it's called is, or stored on, is HMIS data assessment. So I'm going to click on HMIS data assessment. It's automatically going to connect it through assessment ID. So let's add that. And as we're looking at this, some of this will kind of start to make sense to us, because we will see this and we'll say, oh, this is stuff off the universal data assessment, like homeless start date, things like that. Now, one thing you'll note here is there's some fields here, some kind of duplicates. Like we have homeless start date 2014 and we have homeless start date. Why are there two different fields here on this table? So no fields ever really go off of a table or deleted from a table. But we know that HMIS continues to change, right? Like HUD will come up with new specs and things are calculated in different ways. Sometimes it's a brand new question. Sometimes questions are just kind of tweaked. When that happens, sometimes new fields then are created. And that's definitely a case of when you get into things like the universal data assessment, primarily around the 3.917 questions. Those things have been tweaked a lot over the years. So it can be confusing when you're kind of navigating this to know like what's the correct one to pull. But again, this is where you want to go in and pull up the form in the system. So I'm going to pull up a universal data assessment, and then I'm going to go in and open read only, and I can actually see what fields are populating here for each of these options. So I can see here that approximate date homelessness started. If I hover over that, we can see that it is homeless start date. It's not homeless start date 2014, so I don't need to do that. That's going to be old data, how things used to be recorded in the system. We can see here it's HMS times homeless last 3 years is this question right here. So once you kind of get the hang of that, that'll be really helpful in kind of figuring your way around Query Designer. Another thing that you have access to, or you can do when you're on this form, instead of going and opening that form up, you can also do Quick View. I didn't mention that before, but it will list all of the different fields on this form and will list the table structure for it. So sometimes you can just click there and quickly kind of figure out where things are. And then what I was wanted to show you guys, or what we're trying to filter by, is the client location one. And so we can see here that is HMS data assessment is the table, and then client location is the field we want to pull in. So kind of knowing that information now, we've got our table added. Let's go ahead and click Save. Let's go ahead. I'm just going to run this now that we've added all those tables to make sure we're still getting data, and we are, so that's good. Now let's pull in our client location. First off, we're not going to filter by it. I'm just going to pull it up as a column here so I can kind of see what kind of data is there. Now you might expect to be able to see a list here of, Atlanta, different CoCs listed out, or maybe it would be like Georgia 500 and have the number in that way. It's going to be a little different because of the way that the database stores information for that field. So you're going to see some values here. Now we have a chart that we're going to make sure you have access to that lists those out. I will go ahead and show it on the screen here, just so you can kind of see. This is for client location. This is the value that's going to be stored for each of the CoCs. So as long as you kind of know this, this is going to be helpful in setting up filters. So for instance, I know Atlanta CoC is 98. That's how that's going to show there. Now that I've got that information, I could go ahead and we can add a filter, and I can say the client location is going to be equal to 98. So at this point, I would, if for instance I wanted this query moved over production, this was what I wanted to be able to run, this would kind of pass, right? Because we're filtering and we're only showing enrollments where the on the universal data assessment client location 98 was done. If I'm in Atlanta CoC, this is going to be for an Atlanta CoC right here. So now if I run this, of course I'll get a lot smaller list, and these are all going to be 98s here. So these will all be universal data assessments that have been recorded as Atlanta. So a few other things I just want to kind of go over before we got into any more advanced filtering. So while right now we're just looking at the way we connected these tables, we were looking at entry master assessments because we connected it through this enroll assessment ID. Well, we also know there's different ways that assessments are created, right? Or different assessments types, not just entry master assessments. We know that there's during program enrollment assessments you do, there's annual assessments, there's exit assessments you do. What if we want to pull those in? So what we could do is we could think, well, where in the system can I see that on a form, where I can go in and kind of check, go into read-only view and look at the table structure of the form. So to do that, let's pull up I'm just going to pull up a client here that's got enrollment. Actually, I'll probably need to change their security so I can see the enrollments they've got. Here we go. Well, we know link assessments, that will show different assessments that a client has, right? So not just, this is going to show like where you've got annuals or during program enrollment assessments. So just, even though this client doesn't have one of those, just having this form pulled up here, I can go in and I can go look at this in read only and kind of see how this is set up. And I can see that there is, so there's our assessment table, which we're already kind of used to seeing, right? But we can see that there is an assessment enrollment. This is a table we haven't worked with yet. We can also see assessment sort here. Now, one thing I want to mention while you're looking at tables, this says assessment sort there. Now, if you're looking for a table called assessment sort, that actually does not exist in the system, but you can rename, you don't really rename the table itself, but just kind of the label within this form. Those can be changed. They're called aliases. And if you're ever confused on that, if you hover over a table, it'll actually show you the real name of the table. So this is actually assessment. We can see is the actual real name of the table, versus these are, what they're labeled is what they are. So just kind of a little note there. So assessment enrollment, that might get us kind of what we're a little closer to what we are trying to do, but I want to look at a different form here, and it is the associated assessments. Let's go into that and open this up and see what kind of table structure we can kind of see here. So here we get to this table called assessment links. This is really important because this will easily allow you to pull in different assessment types to one enrollment. So you're going to want to refer to this assessment links from time to time when you are building queries. Now just looking at this, it doesn't really tell you though where you need to connect to the enrollment table, right? If we're just looking at this, we don't see case ID, we don't see enroll ID. So if we add this to our pre-existing query, we've got like, how are we going to connect it back to the enrollment? And so I want to, and there's actually a place we can go to see that on a pre-existing form. And again, sometimes these are just, you'll have to kind of hunt around, kind of look at different forms and things like that to kind of figure out what that's going to look like. So I'm going to click on this again. I'm going to click on, let's say, update annual assessment. We've got our HUD enrollment form that comes up. I'm going to go ahead and click done here. Annual. And this is kind of an important step, right? Because now we're starting to add universal data assessments to this. So I'm going to say at this point, I want to go in and I want to look at this. This would say read only, of course, for you. But if I pull this in, I can go look at the data definitions here and start to see a little more helpful information because it's going to have the enrollment table. And I'm kind of used to working with that. So here I can see that the enrollment table is connected to the assessment enrollment table, which actually is called assessment links, which also is a view. We can see the little magnifying glass. As we talked about, views are a little different than tables, but nonetheless, it's connected to assessment links, and it's connected through enroll ID to record ID. Something you would never just guess. But kind of with this information and knowing how this form works and that this is connecting a individual assessment to different, potentially different master assessment types, right? Because we can during this process, what we're doing in this workflow is we're doing an annual assessment right now, and we can see that somehow this is going to kind of connect us to different assessments. Knowing that, I can go into Query Designer. I can, and actually to kind of show this in action, I'm going to do assessment type here. This is going to show what kind of master assessment it is. Is it entry, exit, what have you. If I do this, I'm only going to get ones because that's the way these tables were connected. Because we're using this assessment table connected to the enroll assessment ID. So we want to kind of add this assessment links view in here. So to do that, I'm going to have to kind of rearrange some of this table structure here. Now, to do that, you can, well, one, if you ever need to get rid of tables here, you can right click on them and you can click remove. This is also where you can click alias and change the name of it if just for whatever organizing purposes you need to name it something that makes sense. You can do that here. You can also remove how this is joined. So what we need in this case is we need the assessment links view table to be kind of in between these two. So I'm going to go ahead and click on that and click remove join. At this point we kind of have a broken query, right? Like we can't save this because this thing's just by itself. but we know that assessment links is what we want to add, so I'm going to go in here. I'm going to find that. It's not going to come up as a suggestion, so it's not going to come in already linked or anything to a table. It's just going to be kind of by itself over here. And then here's where I'm going to have to know how these should be connected. So this is where I'm going to say, and I think it was it enroll? Yeah, enroll ID to record ID. So this is where I'm going to, on my query, I'm going to say, here's my enroll ID, here's the record ID. I'm going to click on enroll ID, drag down, and connect to record ID. We've got that there. And then this one's a little easier to connect because this has assessment ID, and this is the master assessment that also goes on assessment ID as well. So that one, a little more self-explanatory. I can just kind of connect and drag there. Now I've got those connected, and I can go ahead and click save. Now let's go ahead and try to run this query. And I'm going to remove the max rows here and click done. And now we can see there's a new kind of row here with a 2 assessment type. And that is going to be for, that is not an entry because we know entry is 1. Well, I say we know that. So one thing to kind of note about pulling in things like assessment type, and you're going to find this with project type, a lot of things like that. Pretty much anywhere there's a drop down within a client track form, if you just go add that field to your query, it's going to kind of show the value behind it. It's not going to be what we would call a human readable value, which would say like entry or exit or things like that. Now for the most part, it's going to go along with the data dictionary. So if you're looking at the data dictionary, you can actually look under the project setup area, and it'll actually show the different project assessment types there, and you'll actually kind of see like entry, exit, and those kind of things. Same with like project types. All project types have like a value behind it. Like 1 is emergency shelter, things like that. But to make it easier when you are creating a query, if you actually want to see that, there's a trick, and that is while you are in the table setup here, you'll actually find that field that you're wanting to bring into your query. And we've already tested this. We know it's pulling in, but it's just pulling in a number, and we want to actually see what the human readable value is here. So what you can do is you can right click on this and hit join to value, and most of the time, this isn't going to happen always, but most of the time, again, if this was a drop down on the form that this is the way this is stored in the system, you can do join to value, and it's automatically going to add another table, and it's going to connect it. And I'm going to go ahead and click save now so we can see this new table. Now this is can be a little confusing because these tables, when you add it like that, all the fields here are going to seem very kind of generic, but it's going to be item description here is what you want to actually pull in. This is where it's actually going to show the assessment type. So a very common thing to do would be to bring that in, and then we want to rename that because that doesn't make a lot of sense to us, and so we want to change that to assessment type and click save. Now let's run this again, and now we can see that 2, that stands for during program enrollment. That's what kind of assessment is there. And of course now we could go ahead and just get rid of that because we don't really need it since we've got that there. So those are kind of, again, some, this is still kind of honestly getting into just kind of covering basic stuff in Query Designer so far as filtering, adding tables. Next we're going to do a little bit more advanced things. So I want to go back and look at filters and cover some kind of more advanced things we can do with those. So I'm going to click on and here so that I get another filter. And Let's look at, so we talked about inner literal value before, and I kind of said that's kind of, for the most part, what people end up using on filters, and that's kind of what I did with these filters up here. But there's also the option that you've got called the current date time. Now all this is going to do is actually going to pull in some SQL code that will say, show me the current date time. So a way you might want to use this is, let's say I wanted to set up this query where every time I run it, it just looks at enrollments with the begin date of today's date. Now I could go in and set that here and type in today's date, but then every time I run this report, I'm going to have to go in and retype that, right? And since you're not going to have write access in production, you actually would not be able to do that, right? However you set this up is going to be how you're using it. And so what I could do is I could do the current date time here. Now when I run this query, it's going to filter by only people that have an enroll date that equals today's date. I don't think we've got anybody in training, with these other filters criteria that were enrolled today, so we're not getting any results here. But that is what that's going to kind of get at. Another thing kind of along the same idea is date add. What that would do is going to use this same get date SQL formula, but it's also going to allow you to add in or subtract a number of days. So if I click date add, I'm going to get this little box, and then I can change this from add or subtract, and then a number, and then however whatever increment I want that to be in. So for example, if I change this to 30 days and then subtracted that, done, and then change this to let's see, how would we use this? Probably do a greater than or equal to. What that's going to look at now is, does anyone have an enroll date that happened within the last 30 days, so 30 days minus today's date, then it's going to show. So if that makes sense. So basically it's looking at today's date and then saying minus 30 days, and then we've got this enroll date saying anything that's equal to kind of that first date in the 30 days or greater, up to today's date. So that is what that would pull in, and we can actually see that now we actually are getting a result here. There was somebody in the last 30 days that's had enrollment. So that's kind of how you can use that. And again, these are nice because it's not actually, there's not a date coded, hard coded in this. It's all just based on whatever today's date then is and then counting back. So that's an option for your disposal. You've also got the option SQL expression. I'm not really going to have the time or really ability. I don't really actually know much SQL myself to get into this, but you can go in and type in SQL here, and so you can kind of do some advanced stuff with filtering in that regards. And honestly, that's what this is. This date add, day minus 30. That is SQL that's in there. In that case, we just were able to kind of have it automatically generated because of the option there that we had. But again, you can get in here and type in whatever you need to do that more advanced filtering. You've also got the option of choosing a subquery. So all a subquery is just a query that's already created in the system that you have access to. And what this will do then is when you click on that, it's just going to give you a list of all the different queries that are in the system. And then you'd be able to select one. And it's going to ask what's the column that we want to use from that query that we are selecting. By default, it's going to say use the first column, but you can go in and change that. So this would list all the columns on that query. So I do want to kind of talk about a couple ways you can, or at least one way you could use this functionality, because this is definitely something I've had to do in the past. So let's say you've created a query that only shows veterans that are chronically homeless and over 62. So you've got this very specific query with filters, and that is the only people that populate on it. So when you click run, it is just going to show you those people. Well, what you can do then is you can take that query, make sure it's got something like client ID in one of the columns, which normally you're always going to include anyways. Then what you can do is you can build a separate query. Say this query is looking at enrollments or looking at services, whatever. You can set up a filter on here, and you could say the client ID is in. So you're going to choose in here. And then you're going to choose a subquery. And this is where you would go then choose that query that you've already made that's just pulling that those particular clients. You'd be able to select it, and then again you'd be able to go in and select what column you're wanting to filter by. So if I was going to, I've already set this up as client ID, so I would do client ID and click done. And again, what this is going to do here is now it's going to say, well, only bring into this query clients where the client ID is listed in the subquery. Now, you're not going to get any of their information as far as, like for instance, say you had it set up where in that query, instead of just it filtering by veterans, you just had a yes/no veteran. You had a column there, so you could tell, when you ran it, if it was a veteran or not. You're not going to be able to bring in any of that information. All this is going to do is just, should this client be brought into this query at all? Should they be a part of whatever we're doing in all of this? Based on their client ID. So that's kind of the use case for that, and it can definitely one, make your kind of life easier on some of the more complex queries that you're building, and then there's also times where really a subquery is needed. There's not really a way to pull what you're trying to pull just by using one query. So I definitely wanted to kind of go over the functionality there. Another functionality that you've got on filtering is parameters. And so we kind of talked about parameters before. And actually, you guys are used to using parameters whether you realize it or not, because the queries that we have menued up in the system for you to run, those actually have a parameter. And that's what you see when you go in, for example, let me go into one of our queries that we've menued up. And when you click on those, well, this one, let's see, that's not a great example. I think one of these should, this has where you can set the start date and the end date within this little box here. So anytime you see that, that is a parameter that has been set up as a filter on this query. And of course, it allows you then to have some flexibility when running the query. This is going to be really important, I think, for all of you, because going back to the fact that you won't have read access in production, you're not going to be able to go change a date per se if there's a date that you have. So if I've gone in and I said the enroll date is equal to particular date here, you're not going to be, every time you run this query, it is just going to show people with an enroll date of this. And a lot of times you're going to want to build a query, right, where you could go in and change that date, right? So kind of a way around this is using parameters. So the way they work is we'd click back on this little @ symbol here, and then this is going to allow us to create a parameter. We can actually name this whatever we want. So I could say start date if I wanted to. It doesn't really matter what you name it. You just want to name it something that'll kind of make sense on the on the other end when you're going in and running that query in production. You could do just enroll date, maybe in this case would be what we'd want to do, and then you could just add that. Oops, and you won't be able to do spaces, so it's kind of a thing that we'll do is do an underscore just to kind of make the formatting look a little bit cleaner. Okay, yeah, now it lets me go ahead and add that. Now once we add that, all that's doing now is allowing me to go into a filter, and now under parameters I'm going to have that as an option. So I can choose enroll date here, and now we've got this is a parameter, so there's not a particular date this is filtering by until I go in and run it and I type in my enroll date there. So you can kind of get inventive with the use cases there of how you want to do that. In theory, you could do things like project ID, where you could type in a project ID and search that way. Keep in mind, though, you would always need to, because that would open up, could open up where you could pull in projects and clients information outside of your CoC. You would still want to make sure you've got adequate filtering set up within the query, where it's just looking for clients that your CoC has served. But again, that is kind of how you'd use parameters. You're also going to see there's some parameters that are already accessible here. So user ID and org are two that we use on a kind of regular basis for some of the queries we've menued up. And what those do is whatever the whoever the user is that's logged in running the query, or what org they're logged in as, will kind of dictate how this query pulls. So if I were to go in and say enrollment and then do the org ID of the enrollment and then say user org, what it's going to do now is, depending on what organization I'm logged in as, it's only going to pull in enrollments from that org. So that's how we set up our user-facing queries that we have in the system. So actually the ones that I just kind of showed you here, you'll notice when users run this, they're not selecting an org, right? They're not selecting a project or typing in anything here, but we've got it hard-coded in the back to use that org ID parameter. So whatever their org they're logged in as, those are the only records that is going to pull in. So that kind of covers some more advanced filtering. Next, I want to look at some advanced filtering we can actually do on the table level. So to do that, I'm going to get rid of some of my filters here because they're not really going to be helpful for this training piece. So let's get us back to here and see what kind of results we're getting. So, okay, so we got these results coming in on our query. We can see that there is one during program enrollment assessment, master assessment, that's being pulled into this. Well, let's say we really only wanted to populate on here, on this column, we only wanted to show when there was a during program enrollment. We don't care about entry or exit or any of the other assessment types. Well, if we go in here and we set up a filter like that, so I'm going to do this. Let's say, so we know that assessment type is actually 1, let's see, 1 stands for entry, 2 stands for during program enrollment. So we could do assessment type equals 2 here, and let's see what results we get here. So because we used a filter like so, we're only getting one result now, right? Because there's only one person with first name John that has a during program enrollment assessment. So we're filtering out all of the people now that don't have a during program enrollment. Well, what if that's not what we're trying to do? What if we're just saying, well, we want to see all of the Johns and all of the enrollments But as far as assessments we're pulling in, we just want the during program enrollment assessments to pull into this column. So what you can do is you can actually go do filtering on the table level. So I'm going to go ahead and delete this filter, and I'm going to go into my edit data definition, and I'm going to go over to the table structure here where we have assessment links and the assessment table. And again, as a reminder, that is kind of represents your master assessment. And so because the master assessment is what we're kind of wanting to filter out, we're just wanting to show assessment type 1. I'm going to right click on this connection here, and I'm going to say advanced filter. And here it's going to allow me to now go in and we can choose assessment, we can choose assessment type, and I can input, let's do 2 there because we want to do during program enrollment assessments. And now let's go ahead and save that and run it and see if we get a different set of data. Sure enough, now we're getting all of the original enrollments we were getting, but as far as the assessment types that are coming in, we're only pulling in the during program enrollment ones. So the other ones just say null. Now while this use case isn't something you'll probably want to filter out as far as assessment types, there are going to be scenarios where this will be something that will kind of be a meaningful way to filter data. So I just wanted to kind of demonstrate the capacities there of filtering on the table connection versus filtering just within the main body of the query itself. So I'm going to go ahead now. I'm going to go back into that table structure and actually remove that filter. And also when you hover over a connection, you'll be able to see if there's any kind of advanced filtering going on. So we can see that when we hover over it. And I can also right click on that. And I forget if I covered this or not, but you can remove a join too. Like if we needed to connect this in a different way, you can right click on a connection and remove it. And also you can remove filters, which is what we want to do right now. So I'm going to click remove filters. This way it's still going to stay joined and everything. It's just not going to have that advanced filter. So now we should be getting our full, yep, we got all our full results here. So moving right along, next I want to cover some advanced things you can do with the labeling up here. So I'm going to, let's get rid of some of these columns here. I'm going to leave program name, roll date, let's see, get rid of that, and that'll be fine. So one thing you'll note, I got rid of first name. I'm still filtering by John. That is still going to work though. It's still going to only show me enrollments that John is the first name, even though I can't see that column. So just a kind of important thing there. Also, you'll note here when I run this query, I'm still getting asked for the enroll date because that's the parameter that we set up previous. But as you noted, I removed it from the filter, so it's just not doing anything more anymore. So even though that's pulling up here, whether I put a date in here or not, it's not going to filter. By that, it's not going to make any difference on my query. So just something to kind of think about when you're talking about parameters. So I'm going to pull in, let's see. Actually, first, let's talk about summarizing our columns here. So when I run this like so, we can see that this client here, there's 3 different projects they're enrolled in. This one has 2, and so forth. Well, one thing we can do, well, actually let's sort these. So one thing that would be helpful for this exercise is sorting. Now up here, up top, we have sort by, and this is where you can actually decide how your query is going to sort. And you can either go in over here and decide something you want to sort by and do it there, or I believe you can actually just do it straight from here as well. Yep. You can drag it up here and that will let you sort by it. So if we just drag that there, and you can do multiple sorts too, so kind of have a hierarchy of how things are being sorted. I'm just going to do by program name now, and then go ahead and run this. Okay, this gets a little bit more of what I was trying to, what I'm going to be trying to demonstrate to you. So here we can see, let's take ATLCE, this project. We can see that there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. There's 7 unique clients that are enrolled in this project, right? For Athens CE project, there is, that person looks like is enrolled twice, but there's 2 unique people there. So what if we wanted to do some kind of counts on our query, where instead of displaying all these client IDs, we would just like to know kind of the counts of how many individuals are in each of these projects. So we can do that straight here in from Query Designer. So in this case, what I would actually do is I'm going to, because I want to know how many unique client IDs are in each program, I'm actually going to right click on client ID and click properties. I think we talked about earlier how you can go in and of course you can rename a column if you want here, but you can also go here to summary, and I can click there, and now I've got several options, and so this is different ways I can kind of summarize the data within this column. And if I say count, it's now going to count the number of times each of those clients are used, and because I have the program name here as the other column, then it's going to let me see how many clients are in each program. So I'm going to go ahead and click save here, and now let's go ahead and run this. And now sure enough, we can see that there are 3 people in our ATLCE, or sorry, 7 people in our ATLCE. Now Athens, it is showing 3, but we know that there's actually 2, there's only 2 distinct clients that are enrolled in that, right? It's really one client received 2 enrollments in Athens, and then one other client just received 1. So it's showing 3 here, which can be a little confusing on that, but that's because we summarized by a count versus a distinct count. So now I'm going to change this to distinct count and save. Let's go ahead and run this again. Now we're going to see that the Athens project is only showing 2, because again it's kind of deduplicating the client list there, and there's only 2 distinct client IDs that are within that project. So summarizing your labels here is a great way to kind of create a query that's really helpful right off the bat, instead of you having to go run it and then do a lot of calculations within Excel or something like that. And of course you can see there's other things you can do, like doing averages or sums, minimum, maximum, those kind of things are all right in here. So I'm going to go ahead and change this back to just none, so we get our full list of clients. And again, you can see that I'm kind of practicing what I'm preaching here. I'm going in and running this query every time I make a change, so I can make sure it's still working and I'm not doing anything to kind of break the query. Next, I want to show you another advanced thing you can do with the labels here. To kind of demonstrate this, I'm going to pull in, let's pull in Social Security number. So here's our Social Security number, and let's see what kind of data we get here. Okay, so we're getting some Social Security numbers here. You know, some don't have it, some it's kind of like a partial. But what if we wanted to make this query where it's what it produces is it just shows the last 4 of the Social Security number? Okay, we don't want a full social being displayed when we run this, when we export it into Excel, and things like that. So we can do that actually. We can go in and we can go to our properties, and you're going to see SQL expression. So this allows you to do quite a lot of things depending on your knowledge of SQL expressions. So I'm going to kind of demonstrate, I guess, a more basic function here with this. But right now I want to just display the last four digits of the Social Security number. So the way I would do that is I'm going to use this SQL expression of write, and then I'm going to call the particular field that I need to reference, because even though this column, this field right now represents Social Security number, when you get into SQL expressions, you have to kind of manually tell it what field, what table, and what field you're actually pulling here. So this SQL expression kind of takes over what this label is going to show. So that's why I had to type in Social Security number here. So I'm going to type in that though, and then 4. And close that out. And what this should do now is it's just going to take the 4 right characters of this field and display it when I run this query now. So I'm going to go ahead and click save here. And let's go ahead and run this now. And sure enough, we are just getting the last 4 of the Social Security number. So this can be something that can be helpful. You can use this in a lot of different ways. Let's take it a step further. What if we say, well, it's kind of confusing only having 4 characters here. What we'd really like to do is kind of pad the Social Security number, and we want to do like a XXX, XX, and then the number. Well, we can actually do that through SQL as well. I can go back into this. For this, I use the concat is going to be the SQL expression. So I'm going to type that as such, and then type in what I want to kind of insert into this. So it's going to be that, and then we'll do a comma, right, we'll leave this, and then go ahead and add this to close it in. So what this should do here is it's going to add this. So first you're going to see this displayed, then it's going to bring in the 4 right characters of the Social Security number field. So let's go ahead and save that and run this. And there we go. We have the Social Security numbers displayed just like we kind of told it to. So again, that is just one way you can use SQL expressions in your columns. And then just as a reminder too, you've also got some of that ability in filtering. You've got your SQL expressions that you can use there as well. Okay, well I think that about does it. That is a lot of information on Query Designer, I know, and a lot of this is just still kind of touching or scratching the surface, but hopefully these will be principles that will help you build the best queries for your CoC. Thanks.